The Chartered Institute of Linguist Awards are given each year for exceptional achievement and inspiring others to learn and use languages. The David Crystal Award was donated by and is named after the world-renowned linguist David Crystal, who is also a Vice President and Honorary Fellow of CIOL. The award this year was given to Bridget Kendall, and the committee's citation reads as follows. Bridget Kendall's distinguished career as a diplomatic correspondent with the BBC has made an invaluable contribution to our understanding of world events and has offered us insights and analyses of critical moments in the history of Britain and the wider world, which have helped to explain and influence our relations with other nations over some 30 years. In all of this, her outstanding ability as a linguist has shone through and offers a living example of the importance of languages that is sure to inspire future generations of linguists. So, Bridget, how did you feel when you heard that you had won the CIOL David Crystal Award?
Well, very surprised, honoured, humbled, and extremely pleased. And pleased on two accounts. One, for an award that recognised my interest in languages, which had never happened to me before. And it's something I do feel passionate about. And I suppose I thought in quite a quiet way, I was a campaigner, always going to schools and encouraging school children to learn hard languages, to have an exciting career like my one. But I didn't really think anyone had noticed. So that was very pleasing. But the other thing that was extremely pleasing is that this is the David Crystal Award. And when I was a schoolgirl, beginning to learn languages and realizing not just that I like languages, but that I was very interested in language per se, it was his books that really opened up to me how fascinating linguistics were. So I was utterly delighted to win an award which is named after him.
How wonderful. So look, we know you for Russian, Bridget, but which other languages do you speak or use?
Okay, so I should confess that my Russian used to be pretty good. It's probably a bit rusty now. I've now been 4 years out of being a news correspondent and haven't been to Russia. I think it's there in the back of my head, but I don't use it on a day-to-day basis at the moment. So I feel a bit abashed when people say, oh, you're fluent in Russian. I don't feel very fluent at the moment. I also studied French up to A-level and at university. I was an au pair in France for a while. That's also somewhere in the back of my head. And I have at various times taken courses in German and Italian, which I love, especially Italian. But I would say that it's just, I just use them in a kind of bumbling, touristy way. I don't really speak them. It's sometimes been very useful as a journalist if you're trying to follow a press conference and there's no translation or read a newspaper or whatever. But I must say that these days, here in Cambridge, the language that I use on a day-to-day basis most of all is Latin. The college grace, admitting scholars to the college and so forth. I'm finding that my schoolgirl Latin has become very, very useful.
How fantastic. Latin, of course, the source and origin of so many of the others. So although, and being self-deprecating is a common feature of linguists, I may say, although you are fluent in Russian, you've also worked with interpreters all around the world. What did you value most about working with an interpreter when you were in the field as a journalist?
Well, I think it's not just the linguistic skills, but a good interpreter or translator is someone who has empathy, and they can kind of understand the person, both who they're translating from and the person who they're translating for, so that they can be that bridge, which is emotional as well as rational. It's not just about literally translating the words, it's about understanding that a nuance came with that phrase, which you might need to fully explain or convey in another way, which isn't literal translation. And as a journalist, for me, what was really important was that when I was working with translators more than interpreters, was that there'd be someone who I'd be going, through a battle zone or interviewing for a feature in a town, various politicians and so on, that they could fill me in on who everyone was. So it wasn't just about the words, it was about the culture, it was about the history. And these were fantastic people. And I think many a journalist would tell you that the quality of their reports often lies with the quality of the translator who's been helping them.
Wonderful. Well, I know our members will absolutely support that, the human content and meaning is so important in translation and interpreting. So in a career where you actually took part in a good many key moments of world history, which is the one that in which your languages turned out to be most useful for you?
Oh, definitely the time when I was Moscow correspondent for the BBC between 1989 and 1994, in with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of communism, and the emergence of a new Russia. And so the fact that I knew Russian meant that I just had so much both broader access to what was going on, but also deeper access. And that was partly not just about linguistic skills, it was also because I'd spent 2 years there studying as a student in the mid-1970s and in the early 1980s. So I absolutely understood the undercurrents of Soviet life, and I knew where people were coming from. So it wasn't just that I could go to a collective farm and go out and talk to the women who were milking the cows without any interface. But also I just understood what their lives were like because I'd lived that life too. And so I could appreciate the excitement, the frustration they had with the old Soviet Union, also to some extent their lack of knowledge of what the outside world was and maybe unrealistic expectations, which leads one to the later developments in Russia when so many people became disillusioned with democracy and market economies and so forth. But that moment, I think I just felt it was just fantastic to have Russian, to be able to, every day I used to go down to the Russian parliament, Soviet parliament. It was a new thing in 1989, and Gorbachev, the architect of perestroika, the first and last Soviet president, he was presiding, and then all the other ministers were there too. And that was where everything was happening, where they were deciding the future of the country. And I just used to sit there all morning listening and taking notes. And there was no translation available. And I don't think you could even take a translator in. So the only other journalists who did that, foreign journalists, were the ones who spoke Russian. And we had a fantastic insight into the politics as it was happening. So that was at the very high level, but at the very low level, if you'd go out into a crowd where people were gathering, never before had people protested in the Soviet Union, and now they were coming out on the streets and the lid had lifted and everyone wanted to talk about politics and so forth. But often they'd be very suspicious of foreigners. I remember I was once in one crowd with an American journalist, and he asked me to translate for him. He didn't speak Russian, so I was translating. And then I was realizing that these elderly women around me were whispering to each other in Russian. What are they doing? They're speaking in English. Do you think that they're foreign spies? So I turned around to them and said in Russian, no, we're not spies. And I can hear what you're saying. This is an American journalist, and I'm British, but I speak Russian. And we're just interested to hear what you have to say. So, it could have been a nasty moment, but actually then they were very pleased to have that connection. And they wanted to talk to us and tell us what they thought. And it turned it from being a slightly tense moment into a very useful one. So there's languages keeping you safe and providing you with insights into what people are saying and doing.
How fantastic. You're literally in the room where it happened. So looking back, you mentioned David Crystal and his early influence on you. At what point do you think, looking back, you first knew that you wanted to study or work in languages?
I think in my early teens. So in my day, he studied French at primary school. I've never been to France. I liked it, but I wasn't very good at it. And then at the age of 12 or so, I started Latin, which I liked a lot. And then a year or so later, I began Russian. And they're both quite analytical languages. I mean, Russian had the added attraction, of course, that it was a different alphabet with this curious sort of spidery figures. And that was very exotic. But I think also being a little older and starting these languages from scratch and thinking, I wasn't catching up with anybody, or, the girls in my class who'd been to France on holidays, I was always behind them. With Latin and Russian, I was on a par, and it was just a matter of how hard I worked. And so I worked really hard at it. And of course, we all know, those of us who study languages, if you work really hard at a language, you get a long way. That's what it's about. It's like practicing anything. And so I completely fell in love with Russian, and then became very fascinated by the ways in which, even though it's an Indo-European language, Russian doesn't operate the way English does. It treats verbs very differently, for example, dividing them into verbs of motion or in lack of motion or action or inaction. And I became fascinated with the idea of how far does the language you speak shape your thoughts. And that's when I started reaching for books by people like David Crystal. So it did, the interest in language came to me through learning a language, which opened my eyes to realize that not everybody thought in the same way.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. I've also heard young people actually saying the same thing about Mandarin, about Chinese, the code, and also the totally different structure grammatically. So over and above that moment of realization, what other advice might you give to a young person who's just at that same age in their teens and thinking about languages?
I'd say if you want to use languages in your life, in your work, try and do what you can to get a good grounding in the language, in the grammar and the vocabulary early on, because you never know later on. You know, I had never any idea I would end up interviewing the president of Russia, or, you know, being caught in a room where something critical is going on. It's really important that A, you understand what's being said, and B, if you're asked to account for yourself, that you get it right and don't make a mistake. So get the grounding early on. You never know where it will lead. And, you know, I felt that I was very frustrated to begin with. How would I get to Russia? This was the Soviet Union. It was almost impossible to go. And I came from a big family. My parents didn't have the money to send me. So the first thing I did was immerse myself in the literature. And actually reading a lot in a language is a very good way for expanding your vocabulary, becoming familiar with it. So you can do that, even if it's hard to get to the place. And nowadays, of course, you can go online and there's lots of audiovisual films and things to be able to immerse yourself in. But then if you have the opportunity to go somewhere, perhaps to study or to do a job, go and immerse yourself in that place. And when I went for the first year as a student, I was in a provincial town. There were 12 of us on British Council scholarships from the UK. So there was a little British group, but actually for the first few months, I made a pledge with my English roommate. We had 2 Russian roommates too, but we were not going to speak English to each other. And I just spoke Russian. I've no doubt we stumbled through and made lots of mistakes, but it's a really, you know, it's an opportunity if you're going abroad to a country where you can speak another language, to try and immerse yourself and not succumb to speaking English, because you'll make so much more headway. And the other thing that I say to young people with languages is this can open so many doors for you. Just look at me. Number one, I'm absolutely sure that if you apply for a job and someone sees you've learned a hard language, they'll think that's an interesting person, let's have a look at them. So, you know, it may help you get the interview for a job. But secondly, it just equips you because you have probably traveled somewhere, you have this skill and discipline, and you've opened your eyes to other cultures, and it makes you incredibly adaptable for all sorts of things. But in and of itself, it's a skill which can make all sorts of things possible. I mean, the reason the BBC sent me to Moscow as Moscow correspondent in 1989 was because I spoke Russian, and they realized that they had to have a correspondent there at that critical time who could speak the language, because everything was moving so fast. You just couldn't operate there if you didn't have it. So yeah, I've been incredibly lucky in my life to have been able to be a foreign correspondent in some very exciting places at critical moments. And languages definitely open doors for that. And I try as much as I can to pass that on to young people, to excite them with the thought that they could be as lucky too.
Wow, fantastic. Well, a bit of luck, but a lot of hard work as well, I think it's fair to say. So, look, news of this award will reach nearly 20,000 people directly through our social media channels, including Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn. Plus, there are over 5,000 avid readers of The Linguist magazine, all of whom will be inspired by your story, I know, Bridget. We'll have an article all about it in there. So if you'd like to find out more about CIOL's other inspiring award winners this year, then please do go to ciol.org.uk/awards. Thanks very much.